I stood outside the courthouse in Phoenix, watching the morning sun turn the glass and concrete building into a wall of blazing light. My hands were shaking. Not from fear, exactly, but from the sheer weight of what I was about to do. I was 32 years old, and I was suing my own father. The family textile business had been my mother's legacy. She had built it from nothing in the late 90s, turning a small operation into a thriving enterprise that supplied fabrics to boutique hotels and high-end restaurants across the Southwest. When she died 3 years ago, she left detailed instructions in her will. Half the business was mine. The other half went to my father, Gregory, with the understanding that we would run it together. That understanding lasted exactly 6 months. Gregory had always been charming. My mother used to call him her silver-tongued devil, laughing as she said it, not realizing how accurate the description was. He had worked in sales for most of their marriage, traveling constantly, always coming home with stories and gifts and promises. My mother ran the business. He just enjoyed the fruits of her labor. After she died, he moved into the executive office like he had built the place himself. Within weeks, he started making changes. He brought in his girlfriend, a woman named Veronica who was barely older than me, and gave her a senior management position despite her having zero experience in textiles. He renegotiated contracts without consulting me, cut relationships with suppliers my mother had worked with for decades, and started funneling money into side projects that had nothing to do with our core business. I tried to work with him. I really did. I scheduled meetings, prepared presentations, brought data showing how his decisions were hurting our profit margins. He smiled through every conversation, nodded at appropriate moments, and then did exactly what he wanted. The final straw came 8 months ago. I discovered he had taken out a substantial loan against the business without my knowledge or consent, using forged documents that included my signature. When I confronted him, he laughed. Actually laughed. "You think you understand business because your mother left you some papers?" he said, standing in the office that should have been half mine. "I have been making deals since before you were born. This company needs real leadership, not a girl playing dress-up in her dead mother's shoes." That was when I knew. He was never going to respect me. He was never going to honor my mother's wishes. He was going to take everything, and he was going to smile while doing it. So I hired a lawyer, a good one. His name was Douglas, and he came highly recommended by a friend who had gone through a complicated business dissolution. Douglas reviewed the case and told me I had solid grounds. The will was clear. The forged documents were provable. We could win this. I filed suit 3 months ago. Gregory responded by lawyering up with an entire firm and launching a counteroffensive that included character assassination, claims that I was mentally unstable, and assertions that I had been stealing from the company. None of it was true, but truth did not seem to matter much anymore. The case moved faster than I expected. Gregory pushed for an early trial date, and his lawyers seemed confident. Too confident. I did not understand why, until Douglas did some digging and discovered the name of the judge assigned to our case. Judge Harrison Whitmore, old friend of my father's, golf buddy. They had known each other for 30 years. Douglas filed an immediate motion for recusal, arguing the obvious conflict of interest. The motion was denied. Judge Whitmore claimed that his friendship with Gregory would not impact his impartiality. He would judge the case on its merits alone. I felt the ground shift under my feet when I heard that. The system I had believed in suddenly seemed rigged. But Douglas told me not to panic. We had a strong case. Documentation. Witnesses. Even a biased judge would have trouble ignoring facts. I wanted to believe him. I tried to believe him. But as I stood outside the courthouse that morning, watching lawyers and plaintiffs and defendants stream through the doors, I felt certain I was about to lose everything my mother had built. I took a deep breath and walked inside. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. I had seen enough legal dramas on television to picture something grand and imposing. But this was just a functional room with wood paneling and fluorescent lights. The judge's bench sat elevated at the front. The witness stand was to the right. 2 tables faced the bench, one for the plaintiff and one for the defendant. My father sat at the defendant's table with 3 lawyers. He wore an expensive suit, navy blue with a subtle pinstripe. His silver hair was perfectly styled. He looked like a man who owned the room. When I walked in, he glanced at me briefly, his expression completely neutral, then turned back to whisper something to the lead attorney. They both chuckled. I sat down next to Douglas at the plaintiff's table. My hands were still shaking, so I folded them in my lap where no one could see. "Remember," Douglas whispered, "we present our evidence clearly and calmly. The facts are on our side." I nodded, not trusting my voice. Judge Whitmore entered exactly at 9 a.m. He was a tall man in his late 60s, with a stern face and gray hair. Everyone stood. He settled into his chair, adjusted his glasses, and looked down at the papers in front of him. "We are here today for the case of Julia versus Gregory regarding ownership disputes of Summit Textile Company," he said, his voice carrying easily through the room. "I have reviewed the briefs from both parties. We will begin with opening statements. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed." Douglas stood and delivered a clear, methodical opening statement. He outlined my mother's will. He explained how Gregory had systematically excluded me from business decisions despite my legal ownership stake. He referenced the forged loan documents. He laid out a timeline of events that painted a picture of deliberate fraud and manipulation. I watched Judge Whitmore's face as Douglas spoke. The judge's expression never changed. He took notes, occasionally glancing up, but gave away nothing. When Douglas finished, the lead attorney for my father stood. His name was Vincent, and he had the kind of smooth confidence that came from decades of courtroom victories. He smiled at the judge, nodded respectfully, and began speaking. "Your Honor, what we have here is a sad case of a grieving daughter who cannot accept that business requires tough decisions. Gregory has run Summit Textile with skill and dedication, maintaining profitability in a challenging market. The plaintiff, while well-meaning, lacks the experience and temperament for executive leadership. Her claims of fraud are baseless. The loan in question was properly authorized. And as for excluding her from decisions, well, one cannot exclude someone who rarely showed up to participate." It was a lie. A complete brazen lie. I had been showing up every single day, fighting for a voice in decisions, keeping meticulous records of every meeting I was barred from, every email that went unanswered, every proposal that was ignored. Vincent continued for another 10 minutes, painting my father as a victim of a vindictive daughter who wanted control without earning it. By the time he finished, I felt sick. Judge Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. "Thank you, counsel. We will now hear testimony. Plaintiff's first witness." The morning proceeded with agonizing slowness. Douglas called witnesses who testified about my mother's intentions, my involvement in the business, and the suspicious circumstances around the loan. Each witness was solid. Their testimony was clear. But I could see it in Judge Whitmore's face. The subtle skepticism. The way he interrupted my witnesses with pointed questions, but let my father's witnesses speak uninterrupted. The small gestures that signaled whose side he was on. During a recess, I pulled Douglas aside in the hallway. "He is not listening to us." Douglas looked tired. "I know, but we keep presenting our case. We create a record. If he rules against us unfairly, we appeal. An appeal takes months, years maybe. The business could be destroyed by then. I know, Julia, I am sorry, but we have to play this through." The afternoon session was worse. My father took the stand, and he was magnificent. He spoke about my mother with apparent affection, describing how hard they had worked together to build the business, conveniently rewriting history to make himself the co-founder rather than the spouse who occasionally helped with sales. He talked about his concerns for the company after my mother died, how he had tried to guide me but found me resistant to advice and emotionally unstable. "I love my daughter," he said, looking directly at Judge Whitmore with perfect sincerity. "But love does not qualify someone to run a complex business. I have tried to protect what my late wife built. That is all I have ever tried to do." I wanted to scream, but I sat perfectly still, my fingernails digging into my palms. Douglas cross-examined him, asking pointed questions about the forged signatures, about decisions made without consulting me, about money moved without proper authorization. My father had an answer for everything. The signatures were not forged. I had signed documents and forgotten. The decisions were time-sensitive and could not wait for lengthy consultations. The money was properly allocated for business development. Judge Whitmore nodded along, occasionally asking follow-up questions that seemed designed to help my father clarify his answers rather than challenge them. By the end of the day, I knew we were losing. The evidence did not matter. The testimony did not matter. This judge had already decided. The trial stretched into a second day. Douglas presented more evidence, including forensic document analysis showing that my signature on the loan papers had been forged. The expert witness was unimpeachable, with credentials from 15 years working with federal law enforcement. He explained in precise detail how the signature patterns did not match my verified signatures, how the pen pressure was inconsistent, how the forger had made subtle mistakes that proved fraud. I watched Judge Whitmore listen to this testimony with a look of profound boredom. When Douglas finished questioning the expert, Vincent stood for cross-examination. "Mr. Caldwell," Vincent said smoothly, "is it possible that someone's signature can vary depending on their emotional state, their physical condition, perhaps if they signed something quickly while distracted?" The expert hedged slightly. "Certainly some variation is normal, but the inconsistencies here go beyond. So there is natural variation in signatures. Thank you. No further questions." Judge Whitmore nodded, as if this somehow invalidated the entire expert testimony. During lunch recess on the second day, I sat alone in a small park near the courthouse. Douglas had gone to make phone calls. My father was probably at some expensive restaurant with his lawyers, celebrating his impending victory. I thought about my mother. She had been fierce and brilliant and kind. She had worked 16-hour days to build something lasting, something she could pass to me. She had taught me everything about the business, about textiles and suppliers and quality control. On her deathbed, she had held my hand and told me to be strong, to never let anyone take what was mine. I was about to fail her. My phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. I almost deleted it, but something made me open it instead. "I heard about your trial. Your father is a fraud. I can prove it. Are you interested?" I stared at the message for a long moment. It could be spam. It could be a trap. It could be someone looking to exploit my desperation. I texted back, "Who is this?" The response came immediately. "Someone who used to work with Gregory. Someone he screwed over just like he is screwing you. I have documentation, recordings, things that will change everything. Meet me tonight." I should have told Douglas. I should have been cautious, but I was drowning, and someone had just thrown me a rope. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop across town at 7 p.m. I told Douglas I needed the evening to decompress and would be ready for the final day of trial tomorrow. He looked concerned, but did not push. The coffee shop was nearly empty when I arrived. A woman sat in the back corner, her face partially shadowed. She looked to be in her 40s, with dark hair pulled back in a tight bun and eyes that looked exhausted. When I approached, she gestured to the seat across from her. "Julia," she said quietly. "Thank you for coming. My name is Helen. I worked as an accountant for your father 5 years ago, before your mother passed away." I sat down slowly. "What do you mean you worked for him?" "I handled the books for some side businesses he ran. Projects your mother did not know about. Real estate ventures, investment schemes, a few deals that were borderline illegal." He paid me well to keep quiet. When your mother got sick, he stopped paying. Said he needed to consolidate finances. I pushed back, and he threatened me. Said he had connections. Said he would make sure I never worked again if I caused problems. My heart was pounding. Why are you telling me this now? Helen pulled out a manila folder and slid it across the table. Because I kept copies of everything. Financial records, emails, recordings of conversations where he discussed hiding assets from your mother. I was insurance in case he ever came after me. When I heard about your trial, I realized this information could help you. I opened the folder with trembling hands. Inside were bank statements showing accounts in my father's name that I had never heard of. Emails discussing property purchases that had nothing to do with the textile business. A printout of a recorded conversation where my father laughed about how easy it was to manipulate business partners who trusted him. Why did you wait until now? I asked, looking up at her. Helen's expression hardened. Because I was scared. I still am. Your father has powerful friends. But I saw your name in the court records, and I remembered your mother. She was decent. One of the few truly decent people I met in all my years doing shady accounting work. She did not deserve what he did to her. What did he do to her? He bled the business dry for years. Siphoned money into his private ventures, covered the losses with creative bookkeeping. Your mother never knew. She trusted him completely. When she got sick, he acted like the devoted husband while still stealing from her. He is a parasite, Julia, and he is about to do the same thing to you. I felt cold all over. Can I use this in court? Helen hesitated. Some of it. The documents are legitimate. The recordings might be challenged depending on consent laws, but they show a pattern of behavior. If you have a good lawyer, this could shift everything. I thought about Judge Whitmore, about his golf games with my father, about the way he had dismissed every piece of evidence we presented. The judge is biased, I said quietly. He is a friend of my father's. I do not know if even this will matter. Helen leaned forward. Then you make it matter. Find the leverage. Every corrupt person has something they want to protect. Find out what the judge cares about, and use that. I looked down at the folder again. My hands had stopped shaking. For the first time in months, I felt something other than helplessness. I felt clarity. Thank you, I said to Helen. Truly. She stood to leave. Destroy him, Julia, for your mother, for every person he has stepped on. Make him pay. I sat in that coffee shop for another hour, reading through every document, memorizing every detail. Then I pulled out my laptop and started researching Judge Harrison Whitmore. I barely slept that night. I sat at my kitchen table until 3 a.m., laptop glowing in the darkness, digging through everything I could find about Judge Harrison Whitmore. Public records, court decisions, news articles, social media posts from family members. I was looking for anything that might explain his relationship with my father, anything that might give me leverage. What I found was a distinguished career, 3 decades on the bench, respected in the legal community. A wife, 2 adult children, 4 grandchildren. He sat on the board of several civic organizations. By all public accounts, he was exactly what a judge should be. But then I found something interesting. A series of property transactions from 8 years ago. Judge Whitmore had purchased a vacation home in Sedona. The price was listed as $400,000, which seemed reasonable for the area. But when I cross-referenced the property records with the seller's information, I noticed something odd. The property had been owned by a limited liability company. I dug deeper, tracing the ownership structure through multiple layers of corporate filings. It took hours of tedious research, following breadcrumbs through business registrations and tax documents. At 4 a.m., I found it. The LLC that sold Judge Whitmore his vacation home was ultimately owned by a holding company that my father had a stake in. Not a large stake, just enough to be involved, but not enough to draw immediate attention. My father had essentially facilitated the sale of a property to Judge Whitmore. On its own, that might mean nothing. Real estate transactions happen. But the timing was interesting. The sale had occurred shortly before a case involving one of my father's business associates came before Judge Whitmore's court. That case had been decided favorably for the associate. It still was not quite enough. I needed more. Something definitive. I pulled out the documents Helen had given me and started going through them again, this time specifically looking for any mention of Judge Whitmore, or property deals, or anything that connected my father's various schemes to the judge. On page 47 of a dense financial statement, I found it. A notation about a consulting fee paid to a company called Whitmore Advisory Services. The amount was $75,000, paid 3 years ago. The notation was vague, labeled simply as legal consultation. I searched for Whitmore Advisory Services. It took some effort, but I eventually found the business registration. The company was owned by Harrison Whitmore Jr., the judge's son. I sat back in my chair, my heart racing. My father had paid $75,000 to the judge's son's company. For what services exactly? The documentation did not say. But the payment had been made, and it had been substantial. I needed to verify this was the same person. I searched for Harrison Whitmore Jr. and found him on LinkedIn. He worked in business consulting, whatever that meant. His profile was generic, filled with buzzwords about synergy and strategic development. But his education and location matched. This was definitely the judge's son. I took screenshots of everything: the property transaction, the payment to the son's consulting company, the timeline showing how these financial entanglements preceded favorable legal outcomes for my father's associates. It still might not be enough to prove corruption. Lawyers would argue coincidence. But it was enough to create serious questions, enough to demand answers, enough to threaten the judge's reputation if examined too closely. Douglas arrived at the courthouse at 8 a.m. I met him outside and pulled him aside. "I have something," I said quietly. "Something big." I showed him the documents. His eyes widened as he read through them, his expression shifting from confusion to shock to grim understanding. "Where did you get this?" he asked. "A former employee of my father's, someone with detailed knowledge of his business dealings." Douglas was quiet for a long moment. "This is explosive. If we present this in court, it could derail the entire trial. The judge would have to recuse himself. We might get a mistrial. But Julia, we need to be absolutely certain about this. If we make these accusations and they are proven false, we could face sanctions. Worse, we could destroy our credibility." "I am certain," I said. "I spent all night verifying every detail. The property sale is public record. The payment to the son's company is documented in my father's financial statements. The timeline is damning." Douglas nodded slowly. "Then we use it. But we need to be strategic. If we come out swinging with accusations, the judge will shut us down. We need to introduce this information carefully, in a way that forces him to confront it." "How?" I asked. "During closing arguments, I will reference irregularities in how this case has been handled. I will mention concerns about potential conflicts of interest. And then, if the judge tries to dismiss those concerns, you will respectfully request to address the court directly. You will speak calmly and factually, presenting the evidence without direct accusations. Let the implications speak for themselves." I felt nervous and energized at the same time. What if he still tries to rule against us? Douglas smiled grimly. "Then we have enough to file an immediate appeal with grounds for judicial misconduct. This becomes a much bigger case, one that attracts attention. Judges do not like that kind of attention." We walked into the courthouse together. My father was already at the defense table, looking relaxed and confident. When he saw me, he smiled slightly. He thought he had already won. Judge Whitmore called the court to order at 9 a.m. exactly. "We will proceed with closing arguments," he announced. "Counsel for the defense, you may begin." Vincent stood and delivered a polished closing argument. He summarized the case as a family dispute blown out of proportion by a daughter who lacked business acumen and blamed her failings on her father. He emphasized Gregory's decades of business experience, his commitment to preserving his late wife's legacy, and his patient attempts to guide an ungrateful child. It was infuriating to listen to. Every word was a distortion of reality, but I sat still, my face neutral, my hands folded on the table. When Vincent finished, Judge Whitmore nodded appreciatively. "Thank you, counsel. Plaintiff's counsel, your closing argument." Douglas stood. He was calm, methodical, his voice steady. "Your Honor, this case is fundamentally about honoring the wishes of a deceased woman who built something meaningful and wanted to ensure her legacy was protected. The evidence we have presented is clear. Helen Summit created Summit Textile Company through decades of hard work. Her will explicitly divided ownership equally between her husband and her daughter. That was her wish. That was her right." Douglas walked slowly toward the center of the courtroom, his hands clasped behind his back. "The defendant has systematically violated those wishes. He has excluded the plaintiff from business decisions despite her legal ownership. He has made unilateral choices that have damaged the company's relationships and profitability. Most egregiously, he has forged documents to secure a loan without proper authorization, using his daughter's signature without her knowledge or consent." Judge Whitmore shifted in his seat, his expression skeptical. "Counsel, we have heard conflicting testimony about those signatures. We have heard testimony from a forensic expert with impeccable credentials who definitively stated those signatures were forged," Douglas countered firmly. "The defendant's explanations have been inconsistent and self-serving. The evidence speaks for itself." I watched the judge's face. He was not convinced. Or rather, he did not want to be convinced. Douglas continued. "This court has a responsibility to uphold the rule of law and protect legitimate property rights. Julia is not asking for charity or special treatment. She is asking for what her mother explicitly left her. What she has earned through years of dedication to the business. What is legally and morally hers." He paused, letting the words settle. "However, I must note something troubling about these proceedings. Throughout this trial, we have observed certain irregularities in how evidence has been weighed and testimony has been evaluated. Plaintiff's witnesses have been interrupted with skeptical questioning, while defense witnesses have been allowed to speak freely without challenge. Our expert testimony has been dismissed, while anecdotal claims from the defendant have been accepted without scrutiny." Judge Whitmore's expression darkened. "Counsel, are you questioning this court's impartiality?" "I'm noting a pattern that gives us concern, Your Honor, a pattern that suggests potential bias." The courtroom went very quiet. My father sat forward at the defense table, his confident expression faltering slightly. Vincent looked alert, sensing danger. Judge Whitmore's voice was ice. "That is a serious accusation, counsel. Do you have any basis for such a claim beyond your dissatisfaction with how I have ruled on objections?" This was the moment. Douglas glanced back at me, a question in his eyes. I nodded. "Your Honor, we have recently become aware of information that raises questions about potential conflicts of interest in this case. Information that suggests a pre-existing relationship between yourself and the defendant that goes beyond casual social acquaintance." "I have already addressed this," Judge Whitmore snapped. "Mr. Gregory and I are social acquaintances. That does not constitute a conflict of interest." "The relationship appears to be more substantial than that, Your Honor. We have documentation showing financial transactions between entities controlled by the defendant and entities connected to your family." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 20 degrees. My father went rigid in his seat. Vincent whispered something urgent to him. Judge Whitmore's face flushed red. "What exactly are you implying, counsel?" Douglas remained calm. "I am not implying anything, Your Honor. I am simply stating that we have discovered information that creates an appearance of impropriety. Out of an abundance of caution and respect for the integrity of these proceedings, we believe this information should be disclosed and examined." "This is outrageous," Judge Whitmore said, his voice shaking slightly with anger. You are making vague accusations without presenting any actual evidence. I could hold you in contempt for this. We have evidence, Your Honor. We did not want to present it publicly without giving you an opportunity to address the situation appropriately. But if necessary, we are prepared to submit it to the record. Judge Whitmore stared at Douglas for a long moment. I could see the calculation happening behind his eyes. He was trying to determine if Douglas was bluffing, how much we actually knew, what the consequences would be if this became public. "Approach the bench," he said finally. Both counsel, Douglas and Vincent, walked to the bench. They spoke in low voices for several minutes. I could not hear what was being said, but I could see Vincent's incredulous expression and Judge Whitmore's carefully controlled anger. Finally, they stepped back. Judge Whitmore looked at the court reporter. "We are going off the record." The court reporter stopped typing. Judge Whitmore turned his attention to me. "Miss Julia, your counsel has made some serious claims. Before I rule on their relevance, I want to hear directly from you. Do you believe you have evidence of impropriety involving this court?" I stood up slowly. My legs felt unsteady, but my voice was clear. "Yes, Your Honor, I do." "And what is the nature of this evidence?" I looked at my father. He was staring at me with an expression I had never seen before. Not anger, fear. "I have financial records showing that my father paid $75,000 to a consulting company owned by your son 3 years ago. I have property records showing that you purchased a vacation home through an LLC partially owned by my father at a price that appears favorable. And I have a timeline showing that these transactions coincided with legal matters involving my father's associates being decided favorably in your courtroom." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. Judge Whitmore's face had gone from red to pale. "Those are serious allegations." "They are documented facts, Your Honor. I have screenshots, financial statements, public records. I did not want to bring this forward. I wanted to believe this trial would be decided on merit. But I cannot stand by and watch my mother's legacy stolen through a corrupt process." Vincent stood up. "Your Honor, this is clearly a desperate attempt to undermine these proceedings. The plaintiff has no proof of any impropriety, only coincidental business transactions that—" "Sit down, counsel," Judge Whitmore said quietly. Vincent sat. Judge Whitmore looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at my father. Then he looked down at his hands. "We are in recess," he said finally. "I need to review this situation. Court will reconvene in 1 hour." He stood and walked out of the courtroom without another word. The next hour felt like a week. Douglas and I sat in a small conference room down the hall from the courtroom. He was reviewing his notes, preparing for whatever would happen next. I sat staring at the wall, my mind racing. "You did well," Douglas said quietly. "That took courage. I just told the truth. Truth is not always safe. Powerful people do not like being exposed." I thought about my father, sitting in that courtroom with his lawyers, realizing that his carefully constructed victory was falling apart. I wondered what he was thinking, if he felt any regret, if he understood that his own greed and arrogance had brought him to this moment. Probably not. People like him never really understood. My phone buzzed. Another text from the unknown number. "Helen. I heard what happened. Well done. But be careful. Your father will be desperate now. Desperate people are dangerous." I texted back. "Thank you for the warning. There is something else you should know. The judge's son's consulting company, it is a shell. It does not do any real work. It exists purely to receive payments that look legitimate, but are actually bribes. I helped set it up. Your father has been paying the judge's family for years." My hands tightened around the phone. This was bigger than I had realized. Not just one property deal or one payment. Years of corruption. "How many payments?" I texted. At least 8 that I know of, totaling over $400,000, all disguised as consulting fees or business expenses. $400,000. That was not a conflict of interest. That was not bias. That was systematic bribery. I showed the texts to Douglas. He read them twice, his expression grave. If this is true, we are talking about criminal activity. The judge could face disbarment, prison time. Your father, too. Is it enough? I asked. It is enough to blow this case wide open. But Julia, once we go down this road, there is no turning back. This becomes a criminal matter. Federal investigators will get involved. Your father will likely be indicted. The judge's career will be destroyed. Your family business will be frozen during the investigation. Are you prepared for that? I thought about my mother, about her sitting in the hospital bed, too weak to stand, telling me to be strong, about the life she had built being stolen by a man who had never valued anything except his own comfort. Yes, I said. I am prepared. When we returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed. My father looked smaller somehow, his confidence gone. Vincent whispered urgently to him, but Gregory was not responding. He just stared straight ahead, his jaw clenched. Judge Whitmore entered and took his seat. He looked like he had aged a decade in the past hour. After reviewing the situation, he began, his voice strained, I have determined that there are sufficient concerns about potential conflicts of interest to warrant further examination. In the interest of judicial integrity, I am declaring a mistrial. This case will be reassigned to another judge, and proceedings will begin anew. Vincent stood immediately. Your Honor, that is completely unnecessary. The plaintiff has not provided any actual proof of impropriety, only baseless insinuations. To grant a mistrial based on such flimsy— The decision is made, counsel, Judge Whitmore interrupted. This trial is over. All parties will receive notification about the reassignment within 48 hours. He stood to leave, then paused. He looked directly at me. Miss Julia, I want to state for the record that I have always strived to conduct myself with integrity. Any suggestion otherwise is deeply offensive. I met his eyes. Your Honor, I have documentation of 8 separate payments totaling over $400,000 from my father to your son's consulting company over the past 5 years. If you have conducted yourself with integrity, I am certain that investigation will prove it. The blood drained from his face. He opened his mouth, closed it, then turned and left the courtroom without another word. My father stood up slowly. For the first time since this whole nightmare began, he looked directly at me with something other than dismissal or amusement. He looked at me with pure hatred. You have no idea what you have done, he said quietly. I know exactly what I did, I replied. I stopped you from stealing my mother's legacy. He walked out of the courtroom, flanked by his lawyers. I watched him go, feeling nothing but cold satisfaction. Douglas put a hand on my shoulder. The hard part is not over. The new trial will still happen, but at least it will be fair. What about the payments? I asked. What happens now? I will file a complaint with the Judicial Conduct Board. I will also send the documentation to the State Attorney General's office. They will investigate. If your source is credible and the evidence holds up, there will be criminal charges. I thought about Helen, sitting somewhere with years of carefully kept secrets, finally using them to burn down the people who had used and betrayed her. The source is credible, I said. We left the courthouse together. Outside, the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. I stood on the steps and took a deep breath of cool evening air. My phone rang. Unknown number again. I answered. Hello? Julia. It was my father's voice, tight with anger. We need to talk. We have nothing to discuss. You do not understand what you have done. That judge was our best chance at a quick resolution. Now this case will drag on for months, maybe years. The legal fees will destroy the business. Is that what you want? To see everything your mother built torn apart by lawyers? You are the one who made that choice, I said coldly. You could have honored her will. You could have worked with me. Instead, you chose greed. You chose corruption. This is your doing. I am giving you one chance to fix this. Drop the complaint against Whitmore. We will settle the business dispute privately. You get 30% ownership and a position on the board. Final offer. I want what my mother left me. 50%. Equal partnership. Or we do this in court with a judge you did not buy. He was silent for a moment. You are making a mistake. No, I am correcting one. I hung up. Douglas was watching me carefully. Are you all right? I am better than all right, I said. For the first time in 3 years, I feel like I am honoring my mother properly. Not by being quiet, not by accepting scraps, but by fighting. He smiled. She would be proud. We walked to our cars. As I drove home through Phoenix traffic, I felt the weight of the past months lifting slightly. The battle was not over, but I had won this round. I had exposed the corruption. I had forced the system to acknowledge its flaws, and I had done it by refusing to be silenced. The news broke 3 days later. A local investigative journalist got hold of the story about Judge Whitmore and the payments from my father. The headline read, "Prominent Phoenix judge under investigation for bribery allegations." The article detailed the payments to the judge's son, the property transactions, and the pattern of favorable rulings for my father's associates. It mentioned my case specifically as the catalyst for the investigation. Within hours, it was picked up by state media. By evening, it was national news. My phone would not stop ringing. Reporters wanting interviews. Old business associates of my mother calling to express support. Even a few lawyers offering their services if I wanted to pursue additional legal action against my father. Douglas called me that evening. The State Attorney General's office has opened a formal investigation. They want to interview you about the documents you provided. They also want to speak with your source. I will reach out to her, I said. Julia, this is good news. The attention means they have to take it seriously. But it also means your father is going to come at you hard. He is facing potential criminal charges. People in that position become dangerous. I can handle it. I know you can. Just be careful. I called Helen that night. She answered on the first ring. I saw the news, she said. Impressive work. The Attorney General wants to talk to you. Will you cooperate? There was a long pause. Yes, it is time. I have been running from this for too long. If I am going to burn my bridges with your father, I might as well burn them completely. Thank you for everything. Do not thank me yet. Your father is not going to take this lying down. He has spent decades building connections and hiding money. He will fight this with everything he has. Let him fight. I have the truth. Helen laughed bitterly. The truth is not always enough. But I hope it is this time. The new trial was assigned to Judge Patricia Holbrook, a no-nonsense woman in her 50s, with a reputation for strictly following procedure and showing no tolerance for games. The first hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks out. In those 3 weeks, my father launched a counteroffensive. His lawyers filed motions attacking my credibility, claiming I had manufactured evidence, and arguing that the mistrial was based on prejudicial and unfounded accusations. They demanded sanctions against Douglas for his conduct in the previous trial. Every motion was denied. Vincent, my father's lead attorney, withdrew from the case. 2 of the other lawyers from his firm followed. Apparently representing a client under investigation for bribing a judge was not good for their reputation. My father was forced to hire a smaller firm with less experience. I watched it all unfold with grim satisfaction. The Attorney General's investigation moved quickly. Helen provided detailed testimony about the payment structure and the shell company. Bank records were subpoenaed. Judge Whitmore's son was brought in for questioning and apparently fell apart under pressure, admitting that his consulting company had never performed actual work and existed solely to receive payments from various sources. Judge Whitmore resigned from the bench 2 weeks after the mistrial. The resignation letter cited health reasons and a desire to spend more time with family. No one believed it. 3 days after his resignation, criminal charges were filed. Bribery, corruption, wire fraud. The list was long. My father was named as a co-conspirator. The business community in Phoenix reacted with shock. My father had been a fixture at industry events for years, always charming, always connected. Now those connections were abandoning him. Former partners issued statements distancing themselves from him. The companies he had partnered with began quietly dissolving those partnerships. Summit Textile Company lost 2 major contracts. Clients did not want to be associated with the scandal. Our suppliers started demanding payment up front rather than extending credit. The business my mother had built was hemorrhaging money and reputation, but I had a plan for that. I called an emergency meeting with our remaining key employees. There were 8 of them, people who had worked with my mother for years and had stayed on despite my father's mismanagement. They gathered in the conference room, looking worried and uncertain. I stood at the head of the table. I know the past few weeks have been difficult. The company is in the news for all the wrong reasons. We have lost clients. We are facing serious challenges. But I want you to know that I am committed to saving this business. My mother built something important here, and I am not going to let it die because of my father's corruption. An older woman named Patricia, who had been my mother's first employee, spoke up. What is your plan, Julia? Because right now it looks like we are sinking. My plan is to remove my father completely from the company. The new trial will give me the legal authority to do that. Once he is gone, we rebuild. We reach out to every client we have lost and explain that the company is under new management. We offer competitive rates and exceptional service. We remind them why they worked with us in the first place. A younger man named Kevin raised his hand. What about the legal fees? The investigation? That is going to cost a fortune. I have been in contact with several investors who are interested in backing us. They see an opportunity to acquire a stake in a solid company that is temporarily undervalued due to scandal. I am negotiating terms that would give us the capital to weather this storm while maintaining majority control. The meeting lasted 2 hours. By the end, I could see hope starting to replace the worry in their faces. These were good people who cared about the business. They just needed to believe someone was actually fighting for it. After the meeting, Patricia pulled me aside. Your mother would be proud of you. She always said you had steel in your spine. I did not fully believe it until now. I learned from the best, I said. Your father never understood what she built here. He saw money and status. She saw relationships and quality and integrity. You understand that? You are her daughter in all the ways that matter. I felt tears prickling at my eyes but blinked them back. Thank you, Patricia. That means everything to me. The second trial began on a Tuesday morning in late September. The courtroom was packed with reporters and observers. The scandal had made this case front-page news. Judge Holbrook entered and immediately set the tone. This trial will be conducted with strict adherence to procedure and evidence. I will not tolerate theatrics from either side. Both counsel will present their cases clearly and concisely. We will focus on the facts and the law, nothing else. Douglas presented our case methodically. The will, the ownership structure, the forged documents, the systematic exclusion from business decisions. He also introduced evidence of my father's side businesses and hidden assets, painting a picture of a man who had spent years deceiving his wife and was now attempting to deceive the court. My father's new lawyer, a man named Robert, tried his best to counter, but he was fighting an uphill battle. The scandal had damaged my father's credibility. Every time Robert tried to portray Gregory as a trustworthy businessman, Douglas would reference the bribery investigation. On the third day of trial, I took the stand. Douglas questioned me about my mother, about my involvement in the business, about my attempts to work with my father after her death. "Can you describe your relationship with your mother?" Douglas asked. "She was my hero," I said quietly. "She taught me everything about running a business, not just the technical aspects, but the ethics. She believed in treating people fairly, honoring commitments, building something that would last. She worked incredibly hard, and she loved what she did." "And after she passed, how did your father treat you?" "Like an obstacle. He made it clear from the beginning that he had no interest in honoring my mother's wishes or treating me as an equal partner. He wanted complete control, and he was willing to lie, cheat, and manipulate to get it." Robert cross-examined me aggressively, trying to portray me as a spoiled daughter angry about not getting her way. But I stayed calm, answering each question with facts. I had documentation for everything: emails, meeting notes, witness statements. Every time he tried to twist my words, I corrected him with evidence. After I stepped down, Douglas called Helen to the stand. She testified about the hidden businesses, the shell companies, and the pattern of deception. She brought documents showing how my father had systematically stolen from the business my mother built. Robert tried to attack her credibility, bringing up her questionable accounting work. But Helen did not flinch. "Yes, I helped Gregory hide money," she said bluntly. "That is exactly why my testimony is credible. I know how he operates. I know the systems he uses. And I know that everything he has told this court is a lie." On the fifth day, Judge Holbrook called both counsel to the bench. "I have heard enough," she said. "I am prepared to rule." Douglas and Robert returned to their tables. I held my breath. Judge Holbrook looked directly at my father. "Mr. Gregory, I have reviewed the evidence presented in this case extensively. The documentation is clear. Your late wife's will explicitly divided ownership of Summit Textile Company equally between you and your daughter. You have violated that directive repeatedly and systematically. The forged loan documents are particularly egregious. You fraudulently used your daughter's signature to secure financing that endangered the company." My father sat perfectly still, his face emotionless. "Furthermore, the evidence of hidden assets and side businesses demonstrates a pattern of deceit that calls into question every claim you have made in these proceedings. You have shown contempt for the law, for your late wife's wishes, and for your daughter's rights." Judge Holbrook's voice grew harder. "I am ruling in favor of the plaintiff. Julia is awarded full ownership of Summit Textile Company. You are ordered to transfer all shares and relinquish any claim to company assets within 30 days. Additionally, you are ordered to pay restitution for funds improperly diverted from the company, the amount to be determined by a forensic accounting audit." I felt Douglas squeeze my shoulder. I wanted to cry, to shout, to celebrate. But I just sat there, letting the moment sink in. Judge Holbrook was not finished. "I am also referring this matter to the State Attorney General's office with a recommendation for additional fraud charges. Your conduct in this case has been reprehensible." She banged her gavel. "This court is adjourned." My father stood slowly. He looked at me across the courtroom. For a moment, I thought he might say something, but he just turned and walked out, his new lawyer hurrying behind him. Douglas turned to me, grinning. "You did it. You actually did it." "We did it," I corrected. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed us. Douglas handled most of the questions, giving a brief statement about justice being served and the importance of honoring legal obligations. I stood beside him, saying nothing, letting the victory speak for itself. The weeks following the trial were a whirlwind. I officially took control of Summit Textile Company and immediately began implementing changes. I brought in Patricia as operations manager, promoting her from her previous role. I hired a new CFO with impeccable credentials to clean up the financial mess my father had created. I personally reached out to every client we had lost, explaining the situation and asking for a chance to earn back their trust. Some said yes immediately. Others wanted to wait and see. A few said no, unwilling to associate with a company that had been in the news for all the wrong reasons. I accepted their decisions with grace and moved on. The criminal investigation into my father expanded. Federal prosecutors got involved when they discovered the bribes had crossed state lines. Additional charges were filed: wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering. The list grew. My father's girlfriend, Veronica, left him. She issued a public statement claiming she had no knowledge of his illegal activities and had been deceived like everyone else. No one believed her, but she disappeared from his life regardless. Judge Whitmore pleaded guilty to corruption charges in exchange for a reduced sentence. He received 3 years in federal prison and permanent disbarment. His son received 2 years. The news coverage was extensive, a cautionary tale about corruption in the judicial system. My father went to trial 4 months after our civil case concluded. I attended every day of the proceedings, sitting in the back of the courtroom, watching him face the consequences of decades of lies. The evidence was overwhelming: financial records, testimony from Helen and others he had deceived, recordings of conversations where he discussed hiding assets and bribing officials. His lawyers tried every trick they could think of, but nothing worked. The jury deliberated for less than 6 hours, guilty on all counts. At sentencing, the judge gave him 8 years in federal prison. 8 years for bribery, fraud, and corruption. His lawyers filed appeals, but they were denied. I was in my office at Summit Textile when I got the call from Douglas telling me the appeals had failed. My father was going to prison. I hung up the phone and sat quietly for a moment. I thought about my mother, about how she had trusted him completely, about how he had betrayed that trust every single day of their marriage. I thought about how close he had come to stealing everything she built, but he had not succeeded. I had stopped him. The business was recovering slowly. We had won back 3 of the clients we lost and had landed 2 new major contracts. The employees were energized, working harder than they had in years. Patricia told me it felt like the old days, when my mother had been in charge and everyone believed in what they were building. I created a scholarship in my mother's name for young women interested in textile manufacturing and business management. The first recipient was a brilliant 20-year-old from Tucson, who reminded me of myself at that age, full of passion and determination. 6 months after the trial, I stood in the factory that my mother had opened 20 years ago. The machines hummed with steady rhythm, producing beautiful fabrics that would become tablecloths and curtains and upholstery for restaurants and hotels across the Southwest. Workers moved with practiced efficiency, taking pride in their craft. Patricia walked up beside me. "We did good this month. Profit margins are up. Employee satisfaction is the highest it has been in years. Your mother would be amazed at what you have accomplished." "I just fixed what was broken," I said. "You did more than that. You saved this place. You honored her legacy in the truest way possible. Not by preserving something that was dying, but by making it live again." I thought about my father, sitting in a federal prison in Texas, stripped of everything he had valued: his reputation, his freedom, his access to the wealth he had stolen. He would be 70 years old when he got out, assuming he served his full sentence. I thought about Judge Whitmore, disbarred and imprisoned, his distinguished career reduced to a cautionary tale about corruption. I thought about all the people my father had cheated and betrayed over the years, and how they must feel knowing he was finally facing consequences. But mostly, I thought about my mother, about how she would have handled this situation. She had been strong, but compassionate, fierce, but fair. She had believed in justice, in honesty, in building something meaningful. I had fought for her legacy not with her gentle kindness, but with her hidden steel. I had learned that sometimes love means standing up, speaking out, and refusing to be silenced. I had learned that justice requires courage. The journey had been brutal, but standing there in that factory, watching the business she built thriving again. I knew it had been worth it. My father spent the next 8 years learning what powerlessness felt like. The man who had spent his life manipulating others, buying influence, and escaping consequences, found himself in an environment where none of that mattered. Fellow inmates did not care about his connections. Guards did not care about his charm. He was just another prisoner, stripped of the identity he had constructed. His assets were seized to pay restitution. His reputation was destroyed beyond repair. The business associates who had once courted his friendship now pretended they had never known him. He became a ghost, a cautionary tale, a footnote in a story about corruption and downfall. As for me, I built something my mother would have been proud of. Summit Textile Company thrived under my leadership, not because I was ruthless, but because I honored the values she had instilled in me. I treated people fairly. I built genuine relationships. I focused on quality and integrity, and every morning when I walked into the office, I felt her presence, her quiet pride in what I had become. The girl who had almost lost everything had become the woman who reclaimed it all. Sometimes I still thought about those 2 words I had whispered in that first courtroom, the words that started everything. Whitmore Advisory. Revenge, I learned, was not about cruelty. It was about truth. And truth, when wielded with precision, was the sharpest weapon of all.